Hi, everybody. Welcome to Elevated Perspectives, Critical Conversations in Cloud Computing. This is a new event series presented in collaboration with our AWS partners, where we bring you the latest cloud computing insights, trends, technical best practices for R&D teams in life sciences. I am Michael Reiner, the President and CEO of RCH Solutions. With me today is Phil Echelier, our Chief Technology Officer. Today, we're talking about everyone's favorite cloud topic, security. And joining us is Hector Rodriguez, the Principal Industry Specialist and Executive Security Advisor, WWPS, Health and Life Sciences at AWS. Hector, I want to first thank you for being here. Could you tell us a bit more about your role and background before we get started?
Sure, Michael. And hello, everyone. Happy to be here. And security is definitely my favorite topic. In my role, I am a technologist through education and throughout my career, have been in different roles as a software engineer, but then solution architect, and got involved in cloud computing early stages, but realized there was a real need to focus on security, privacy, compliance, particularly in these highly regulated industries. And industries like life sciences, where data is absolutely critical, the sharing of data, the ability to do research, and hopefully accelerate the processes of life sciences, things like drug discovery, clinical trials, and so on. And that's what I focus on, is really helping organizations harness these new capabilities, really fail fast so they can succeed faster, but bringing best practices around security, privacy, and compliance for the life sciences, the healthcare industries is where I focus.
Okay, great. Thanks, Hector. All right, I'm going to jump right in. There's actually three sections to this. The first one is an overview of security challenges and trends. The second one is we're going to talk about the challenges more of a strategic level. And then finally, we're going to leave you with some technical recommendations and best practices. So why don't we jump right in? Excuse me, Hector, I'll start with you. There's more data in multiple structures than ever before. And as we've seen and we know, it's increasing. There's lots of old and new data-intensive processes in life sciences. Can you share your thoughts on how this reliance in those processes in life sciences is impacting the need for secure cloud storage and computer processing?
Yeah, the life sciences industry is quite interesting because they need data, and the more data driven they become, the better off they're going to be. And something I mentioned earlier, they're going to be able to fail fast when it comes to things like drug discovery, running clinical trials, and really bringing new therapies to market. But we do see data being created everywhere, from devices, from individuals, from these different processes, and it's being created in different formats. We get lots of different signals. And unfortunately, it is also stored in very disparate locations across different organizations. And one of the challenges is sharing that data and making sure that we can all benefit, regardless of your role in these processes, benefit from that information. And and it is being created at an exponential rate, as you mentioned earlier. But that just means we have more data, we have better data. The pandemic is a great example of that. We learned more about how to take care of ourselves, how to take care of our communities as we gathered more data. And so the answers kept evolving to the questions that we were all asking about: what is this? What's going on? And I think that those basic theories are going to continue to apply, but we have to get better at data interoperability, data sharing, and also making sure that we keep our data secure, that we keep it confidential, that we're focused on data integrity, data protection, and making that data available to the people who need it, when they need it, and why they need it.
Okay, great. Phil, I'm going to ask you to elaborate on that a little bit and talk about the abundance of data and structures and the new tools that customers are using. Can you talk about, with all this preponderance of data, what are the potential consequences of a data breach or data breaches?
Yeah, so there's no doubt that data is ballooning, and I think in 2 years from now we'll say that same thing, but ballooning will mean something much more at that point in time. It's, as Hector said, it's exponential. But let's be clear: data is the asset. no matter how you look at it, that's what everyone is working on. And that, whether it is for drug discovery now, clinical later, or going back later and doing AI models with it, it is the asset. So it needs to be protected. Data breaches can be catastrophic. So as an IT provider, one of the primary rules is don't lose data, which, it's operational. You can't have data that can't be restored if it was deleted, but it also can't be stolen. But at the same time, it's not just about stealing. People could inject data that's flawed or tainted, and you no longer have the asset that you think. And I think it's also very important to remember that, look, the internet is a scary place, and security and break-ins from the outside are a real threat. But break-ins from the inside or theft from the inside is also a concern. And not that employees aren't trustworthy, but every once in a while there's an exception. And so you have to have security that's comprehensive, not just safety from the outside.
Mm-hmm. Okay. It's interesting because Hector made a comment about finding people have data and access to data in multiple places on, handheld devices and laptops and stored all over the place. We see that every day, regardless of the size of the company, big companies, small companies, and we've seen incidents. So Hector, let me go back to you and let's talk about the security incidents and disruptions in R&D. How do those incidents affect research, specifically research timelines and the overall success of organizations? And then finally, what steps can be taken where they can mitigate those potential impacts?
Yeah, the research process is where it all starts, right? We call it drug discovery, and so on. And we have to make sure that data is as right as possible right from the beginning. And that means something that Phil mentioned. When we're trained to be chief information security officers, we're taught that it's our job to protect the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability of the data. But integrity is so critical. So knowing where your data comes from, where did it start, what is that lineage of the data, is absolutely critical to having good, clean inputs. And today we're seeing those challenges. Everybody talks about generative AI. It's a powerful science, really data science. And I think it's great. It has a lot of potential. But one of the concerns is, where did that data come from? How clean is it? Is it what's its real value? Can I trust it? And we have to build that trust into our data right from the very beginning. So when we look at solutions that are evolving, it does go back to a technology that we're also talking a lot about called zero trust. And zero trust is not really a technology, it's a process. But there are organizations that focus on the concept of zero trust data. And that means tagging your data, identifying it, and giving it value, trusted value right from the beginning. But by doing that and building a zero trust approach to your data, like you would with identity, with your devices, it means that you know where your data's come from, you know where it is, and you also know where it's going. And others can also look at that data lineage and rely on the fact that the data is trusted, it's been proven, and that it's usable to them. Right? It's really about increasing that confidence level in that data.
Yeah, thank you for that feedback on zero trust. Phil, can you talk about what steps, or in addition to what Hector talked about, can be taken to mitigate those potential impacts?
I think he's covered it fairly well. Back in the day, it was always about what's the raw data. It's got to be, write once, read many. It's immutable, but you don't really know where it's come from. And so there's really three tiers in our world as you ingest data. There's the raw, which is untrusted. There's curated, which is any kind of normalization you want to do with the data. And the third step around trusted, it's really the trusted data tier that you want to have be your consumable. And then you mentioned earlier about data on individual devices. And, there's an argument for that. Hey, you have a traveling salesman that, may not have network, or you'll have a research scientist that says, the network's too slow. I need it local to my workstation or my laptop. But once it's out of control, out of the control of an IT platform, you really can't maintain that trust. So having things in a trusted environment and consume workflows that consume appropriately from that are critical.
Let me ask you guys one more thing when we talk about security challenges or trends in the industry. One of the biggest one, if not the biggest one, is number one, what Hector talked about, which is the increase in remote work due to the pandemic. And the other part is because of the dynamics and changes of the industry is collaborations. Companies aren't doing so much on their own anymore. They're collaborating with other big companies, small companies. So what have these collaborations and remote work done is they've increased the access to more data, right? And I'm wondering, I'll ask Phil first, how has this intensified the need for more robust security policies for cloud usage and cloud access?
Well, I think the need for security is consistent. I don't think there's ever been a point in time where we were relaxed about it. But remember, with the public cloud, it used to be back in the day that you would always upload your data to where the compute was. But now, with the public cloud, the paradigm is bring the compute to the data. And to me, that holds for the remote worker. It's better to have a remote desktop or a remote workstation in the cloud topologically close to the data than bring the data down to outside your network onto somebody's laptop. The same holds true for collaboration. You're going to cordon off a section of the public cloud that's, specifically for a given collaboration, allow access to the data that's needed, and have the collaborators bring their data there. You don't send your data out somewhere where it's not trusted.
Yeah, good point. Hector, can you talk about the collaboration and remote work and how that's intensified the need for more robust security policies?
Yeah, I think it's an area where we weren't just driven there by the pandemic. That to me, that was one of the positives where we learned how to work remotely, how to collaborate, and also be very productive. But when we look at where we're going with remote clinical trials, for example, remote patient monitoring, that means we're all going to be wired up with different devices depending on what our needs are in that, again, drug development life cycle or that care management. And we're going to be creating that data. So it's really critical that we focus on making sure the data is as right as possible. It's normalized as much as possible, as Phil said. Today, we lack a lot of those types of standards and frameworks, but we are seeing more work being put in around device security from the FDA and organizations in Europe. So those problems have focus and they're solvable, but we also need to make sure that we create this secure chain of custody for data. And we can learn from previous technologies. If it's blockchain, where we use consensus to make sure everybody agreed that this transaction was real, we can learn from that. Even with the concept of generative AI and large learning models, we just need to make sure they're curated, we crowdsource them properly, and everybody agrees that this data is correct, but then we keep it correct. And it does mean we're going to have to make sure we've got the right layers of data protection, data encryption, and permissions around that data, because it is going to be heavily relied on in those collaborative environments. And we are going to see, I went to a precision medicine conference where there were people from all over the world, and that was what they want. They want to be able to share data. They want to be able to collaborate more, but they want to make sure that the data is trusted and has been curated as we continue to mention. But that's really at the core of what has to occur.
Okay. I'm going to move on to the second part, guys. And let's talk about the challenges at a little bit more strategic level. RCH, like AWS, we work with work with both big companies and small companies. And the challenges are different, right, that they both face in terms of cloud security. Phil, I'll start with you. Can you talk about how their needs and approaches differ?
Yeah, I'm not sure that the needs differ. I mean, in the end, security is security. I think the larger companies are going to have bigger budget. They're going to be able to go out and buy more tooling. But in the end, it all starts with governance and the right set of processes to support your security model. There has to be a data management and a data protection scheme, which is defined and then you implement with your technology. I think the main difference is that a smaller company, in AWS terms, is more likely to just use AWS native tools to begin with, and maybe add on later as budget permits, where the big guys will go out and buy big fancy tools right away, which I'm sure they're helpful, but you still have to start at the beginning with the right processes and frameworks.
Yeah. 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 Hector, I'm sure you have a lot of experience as well between big and small companies. Do you see how they
Yeah,
different approach?
I agree. Well, the bigger companies, as Phil mentioned, they do have bigger budgets. They've been focused in these areas for a longer time. I work with a lot of smaller biotech researchers, life sciences research companies, or uh, your contractors and so on, and they're providing really good services, but they are concerned about security. But what they're looking for are more completed solutions, managed services. They don't have the budget to stand up a security operations center, to hire full-time CISOs in some cases, but they really can benefit from collaborating with these managed services providers to give them those strong foundations. Now, one of the things, as Phil said too, it's at AWS, we focus on what makes organizations more resilient. How can they make sure that their data is resilient, their applications are resilient, their networks, their people, their supply chain, right? Because all of this comes into play when you're talking about the value chain of the life sciences industry. And so you have to focus on a much more holistic resilience model where you're covering as many of those bases as possible. And it does become a weakest link type of exercise. And you've got to understand where your risk exists, where your weak links are, and focus on filling those gaps. But I do want to emphasize something I said. It's also about people, making sure your people understand that security is everybody's responsibility. What is their role in
Yeah.
how they manage that data, how they use it, how they move it forward, and so on. So having a great data management program in place, absolutely critical. Making sure your people are part of the solution, just as critical.
Yep. Yep. Phil, we use a term often you call the quote M&M unquote security model. Um, hard on the outside, soft on the inside. Can you talk about and describe how large enterprises and maybe even small companies can transition to a more robust security practice? If you have, you elaborate on, if you need to, please elaborate on what you mean by the M&M security model in your experience.
Yeah, so it's a tongue-in-cheek comment. If you think about the data center 20 years ago or 30 years ago, maybe even longer, I mean, security was comprised of there'd be a firewall on the outside. We must protect our data from the outside world, and that's the hard outside, crunchy shell. But once you get inside, everything is soft and chewy. But when you look at people were worried about transitioning to the public cloud, saying, "Oh my God, that's not my data center; it won't be secure." But the reality is, the public cloud is really more secure than a traditional data center. Look at AWS, for example. It's a single vendor solution. It's homogeneous and with security controls on every platform service, infrastructure service. And you can set up a policy, define things, do things like enforce encryption at rest, encrypts it in transit. So you have security throughout your piece of candy. It's not the soft, chewy center.
Okay. Hector, you made a comment earlier in the last topic we talked about of instilling this culture of cloud security and how important it is. It's interesting because when we walk in and talk to customers, specifically the startups and kind of the emerging customers, they take their behavior from prior experiences in terms of using tools to apply to the cloud. And part of that has to do with security. I can go so far as to say, depending on someone's responsibility, they have a particular tool they want to use or vendor they want to use just for their particular challenge. And we consistently talk to our customers about the most important step, the first step in cloud planning, and that's to design the foundation, the platform first. So thinking about that, how can organizations foster the security-minded culture that integrates security at that platform design level rather than just treating as an afterthought?
I think one of the things that I always recommend to customers, regardless of size, but particularly small customers, startups, but even large customers, need to really walk back through what best practices are being observed and implemented by their cloud service providers. When you have organizations as large as AWS and even our competitors, we see a lot of what's going on when it comes to security, privacy, and compliance around the world. And we have to build, as Phil said, we have to be more secure than anyone else. It's the business we're in.
Yeah.
If right? If something happens to a major cloud provider, the industry suffers, and everything else we do is impacted. But those best practices, those patterns, something that we call landing zone accelerators, are in place to help organizations get started with this foundation that gives them those security, privacy, and compliance controls, that gives them the monitoring and the observability, but also has automated a number of those components. It's also giving you real-time insights into your security posture, into your risk scores, into your resilience type of scores. So quantifying where you are today in your security posture, making sure you understand what that feedback is telling you and how to make those improvements is absolutely critical. And it does mean adopting more modern techniques, the ones that I'm mentioning, so that your organization, your security culture is also being modernized. And the last point I'll make on this is I walk into a lot of customers and we walk through their disaster recovery processes or incident response. And what we find is these were written 10, 15, 20 years ago, and they're really good, but they don't apply to a hybrid multi-cloud environment or where you have a lot of third parties. So this collaborative environment, I can guarantee you most customers don't know what the security posture is of that other group they're trying to collaborate with, and they should.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Yet they're expected to trust.
Yeah.
yeah. Phil, anything else you want to add there when we're talking about the design level?
No.
Okay, great. Why don't we move on to the last part of it, and that is some technical recommendations and best practices I'm sure you both have. So the first question is this: how can organizations implement a physical, a technical, and administrative controls to create a cloud environment that's truly in control? Phil, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so I'll hit on physical because that's something that gets overlooked a lot when we talk about cloud security. The perspective is it's cloud, there's nothing physical, it's somewhere else. Yet you're going to have something on-prem, or you're going to have remote workers with some level of trust. So you have to expand that physical security to those locales. Otherwise, how is trust warranted? And I think that's something that's really important to keep track of. I don't know if Hector wants to jump in on the tech and admin.
Well, I just want to drill a bit deeper on the physical. I live in an area of the US where there are data centers or data center regions from a few of the big cloud providers. And I can guarantee you the physical security is approaching what's called Gen 4 type of security. And I won't go into all those definitions. It is kind of an optimal, very aspirational place to be. But what you can see, you see the guards, the guns, the gates, as they say, but also the redundant power supplies, the redundant fuel supplies, and everything that needs to be in place to make sure that you can bring up a very resilient architecture where you have those disaster recovery requirements to recover very quickly in case of a disaster, right? To meet your response point and your response time objectives from the physical side with all those protections and redundancy, right? That's that one. But that also talks about the technical. You need to do your homework and make sure you understand how is data leaving and entering those cloud data centers. Do you have access to private networks? Are they using fiber optic? What other technologies can you implement to make sure that you can encrypt those connections from point to point, both in transit and at rest? It's one of the things at AWS, we have about 119 services that store or transmit data. All of those services have deep encryption capabilities that are at the control of the user. They're configurable, but they are built in at design. It's not an afterthought. And that's also a really critical component of your technical design. Security should be what you do first. You also have to consider privacy and compliance. And when you build that into your design process, when your developers work that way, you actually have less security gaps and vulnerabilities when you deliver the end result.
Yeah. So while we're talking about AWS, let's talk about some AWS native services. How do these services, native services such as AWS Backup, Verified Access, Payment Cryptography, how do they contribute to addressing cloud security challenges and maintain this continuous security posture. Hector, I'll start with you.
Yeah, one of the things, and this goes back to even asking how do you approach it, it is critical to follow a framework. You don't want to be all over the place with how you design your security architecture, how you measure posture. So at AWS, we're really good about making sure that we meet or exceed the security, the privacy, the compliance requirements of multiple regulations around the world, multiple frameworks. In the US, it's FDA and a number of other ones for life sciences, but in healthcare, it could be HIPAA and HITRUST. In Europe, it's GDPR or Data Protection Acts. And then these all get mixed up together. So you're looking at thousands of controls that have to be in place and making sure that you do that for all of the services that you enable in your cloud. Now, we also have over 40 different services that just focus on security capabilities. In those services, there are hundreds of different features and components that, again, are configurable. And it's multi-layered. If you look at something like AWS Backup with Vault Lock, it's all about protecting your data, making sure that you have protected backups, timely backups, that you can manage them, but that you can also create those immutable capabilities. So data immutability, infrastructure immutability is a real it's a newer concept over the last couple of years, but it's a great way to make sure that you are protecting your data right at the beginning, and that you're making protected backups and you're keeping those away from attackers, because attackers are smart. They're after your backups too. They're not just after your current application or your current data store, because they want to make sure when they do their damage that they're going to get paid for in a ransomware, or that they've done the right level of damage. So those bring up other things, such as you mentioned, verified access and verified permissions. And I mentioned zero trust earlier. A lot of organizations or people say, well, zero trust is just a buzzword. It's actually not. It's very real. And when you follow the zero trust tenets as defined by NIST or any other zero trust framework, they focus on identity, they focus on protection, they focus on assuming that everything in your organization is a resource and none of those resources should be trusted. So you need to verify their authorization, their authentication, their access requirements all the time. And this moves us to real-time posture management. And that's what AWS does with these new services in the cloud, is making sure that if you say you are on the network and you bring a device, that you really are who you are, that you belong there, and that you only get access to the things that you need access to in order to do your work.
Yeah, trust but verify. I've heard that before. Hey, just a couple more questions, guys, before we move on. We at RSH pride ourselves in being product agnostic, so then we can provide the best recommendations for our customer instead of trying to push a specific product. But we often talk about choosing a tool to fit the shape of the problem instead of the other way around. Phil, can you talk about that and how things such as AWS services, we've helped teams with a cultural shift toward organization and tools?
Yeah, so sure. So Hector talked. There's a lot of value in that last set of feedback from Hector. But if you look at things operationally, a bit up the stack, you look at an AWS service like GuardDuty to help with automation and checking of security concerns, or we're a fan of a third-party product called Termite Guardrails. Whatever the technology you want to choose, you want to be in an operational sense. Gone are the days of some guy sitting and looking at a screen waiting for a red light and taking action. Mm-hmm. It's all got to be automated there, and if at all possible, you want some kind of counter actions to be definable so that you have self-healing opportunities for self-healing as well.
Yeah, Phil, I just want to comment on that, because you hit the nail on the head. It isn't about the cloud provider or the tool. It's about the capabilities that they have in place that you could take advantage of, and how much visibility and observability do you have into the work that's going on. So you're getting the right level of logging. Are you getting the right level of encryption controls? Are you getting that threat and automated threat intelligence service, as you mentioned, from GuardDuty, but everything else that has to happen in that environment? And historically, that has been the challenge, is that someone brings together a security app and they say, oh, this is a zero trust solution, but it really only solves parts and pieces. And by having a cloud service that has a number of other capabilities, you're able to really put together your security model and your security capabilities as you need them to work for your organization.
One more question, guys. I'll ask you both this. I'll start with Phil. Any final thoughts you'd like to share regarding security trends and best practices for folks in the life sciences industry?
I think we've covered it all. I mean, you said trust but verify, but if I look at it, you start with security being a top-down focus, and we've talked about that. We talked about you have to engineer in security. It can't be after the fact, and if it's engineered in properly, it still has to be maintained and managed ongoing properly. But again, test, retest, verify. Don't necessarily trust what you think you have. Get a third party, audit, test from the outside. If you're testing from the outside, don't tell your ops team you're doing it. Let's see how long it takes them to figure out someone's trying to break in. So there's lots of components here, but test and trust it but verify.
Okay, Hector,
or don't trust it and always verify. That's the I think I go back to focus on people again. When we learn to be CISOs and what the job of a CISO is, we were historically taught that people are your biggest risk. I actually think people are your first line of defense, but that does mean putting in the right levels of training and awareness. What Phil said, make sure that you're testing and walking through paper-based exercises for tabletops, which we do a lot of when you're incident response. But think about that. When there is an incident in an organization, everybody has a job to do. Everybody has to learn how to preserve evidence, how to respond to a potential attack on their individual device, on their servers, on their cloud app. And so that's just done through training. And I know it takes some effort, but when you do it and you do it consistently, you operationalize those into the way that people work, it actually will dramatically improve your organization's security posture and ability to be more resilient.
Yeah, it's not a cost, it's an investment.
Mm-hmm.
Correct. Thank you. Yeah, we've covered a lot of stuff today. We all agree that data is the most important asset. You have to start with developing sound security policies, whether it's a big company or a small company. That security should start at the design level, and we should make sure we have people bought in really early on, because as you just discussed, they are the front lines to any potential security challenges that we have. So I want to thank both of you, Hector and Phil. Thank you for your time today. Remind those of you that are watching, we have other upcoming episodes. You can learn more at rsagesolutions.com, Elevated Perspectives. And as always, we encourage you to provide feedback and suggestions for our future sessions. Thank you, everybody.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure.
Bye-bye.